say, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. And without a doubt, this is one of the most difficult verses to unpack. What is interesting is that when we look at how this verse gets translated across history, what we find in most of our current English translations is, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And this has become one of the most common translations since about the 1940s. There are some new translations that translate it differently. Earlier translations were not as quick to translate this passage in this way. Many of them actually saying it was more about dominating rather than having authority over. In the old Latin translation of the 2nd to 4th century, it said, neither to dominate a man. The Vulgate translation in the 4th and 5th century had domineer over a man, and the bishops in 1589 had to usurp authority over a man. And this is all because of the word authentine. And this is where we get into some really interesting word dissections. What is interesting is that Paul chooses to use the word authentine here, which is not the general word used for authority in the New Testament. There are a few common words, but the most common word for authority in the New Testament is exousia, which is used over 100 times in the New Testament. In Matthew 28:28, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me, and that word is exousia. If Paul had wanted to convey this ordinary sort of exercising of authority, then he could have used that word. Instead, he chose a different word, and therefore this word must carry some sort of nuance that was particularly suited to the Ephesian situation. And so what does this word mean? Now, the problem we have with this word is that this is the only occurrence of the word in the entire New Testament. And therefore, the interpretation principle that we have, where we are meant to use other elements of Scripture to interpret what Scripture says, we cannot use. And what this is known as a hapax legomenon, and I've been practicing that word even in my sleep over the last couple of weeks. So this is a hapax legomenon because it is one word that is the only time it's seen in the entire Scripture. And what we are told in hermeneutics and interpretation principles is that we should never build a theology based on a hapax legomenon, because Scripture should always interpret itself. In this case, we cannot go to Scripture to interpret this word, and so we have to look elsewhere. Now, in the Septuagint, which was a version of the Old Testament translated from Hebrew to Greek that included some of the Old Testament and some other books that never made it into the canon of Scripture, we find a book called Wisdom. And in that book, there is the word authentine. And that word is used to describe parents who kill their children. Within classical Greek, the word authentine is used to describe kin murder, so murder of a family member. It is used to describe suicide, or it is used to describe the mastermind behind a crime. Biblical lexicographers J.P. Lau and Eugene Nida put authentineio into the semantic domain to control, restrain, or domineer. And they define the verb as to control in a domineering manner. And therefore what we have is, I do not allow women to dominate men. Therefore we can assume that what Paul is talking about here is not teaching with authority, exousia. What we can deduce is that Paul is saying that women should not teach in a way that is dominating, domineering, manipulative, or power hungry. And this translation fits really well with the rest of the passage, where Paul is saying women should have the opportunity to learn. Women should be submissive to their teachers. They shouldn't teach in a way that dominates or that is manipulative, but they should in calmness. It also fits with the culture. Ephesus was a place where women led. They led the worship of the Artemis cult, and therefore it's understandable to assume that women converts to Christianity still wanted to try and lead, and yet they hadn't learnt. And so Paul is therefore not stopping them from leading, but he is encouraging them to first learn. This translation also fits well with what we know of Paul. Paul was radically countercultural in the way that he worked alongside, raised up, sent out, and elevated women throughout the New Testament early church. If one text doesn't match up to the whole practice and actions of Paul, then we probably need to question our interpretation of the text. And what we have seen of Paul is that he has no problem with women leading in the early church, and he has no problem with women leading in Ephesus. A few weeks ago, I spoke about some of the New Testament women who led, and we looked at Priscilla. And what we saw that was roughly in AD 51, Priscilla and her husband went along with Paul to Ephesus to spread the gospel and to plant churches. Paul leaves them there, and later on, we are told that Priscilla is in Ephesus and she teaches a man called Apollos. In AD 57-58, Paul greets Priscilla in his letters to both the Corinthians and to the Romans, saying that she's a co-worker of his and that she is a church planter. Then a few years later, in AD 63, we have this letter where Paul is suddenly saying, women can't teach. And then a couple of years later, we have 1 Timothy 2, where Paul again greets Priscilla. And so what we have is that Paul's actions do not show that he prohibits women from leading or teaching. In fact, his actions show the exact opposite. And therefore, we must have misinterpreted this one verse, forgetting to let the clear illuminate the unclear. Because what is clear is the way Paul has treated and elevated women to positions of leadership and authority. And what is unclear is one verse in Timothy that uses a word that is not used anywhere else in Scripture. Also, we need to make sure that when we create one thing as a timeless principle, that it is reasonable to make the other related instructions also timeless. Similarly, if one element is context sensitive, then it would make sense that the other elements would be read in the same light. If we believe that Paul is saying women cannot teach, then we also have to enforce the idea that men can only pray if they have their holy hands raised. Because Paul says, I want the men everywhere to pray raising holy hands.